most common thing I get asked when people see this, either in the shop or out in public, is what is it? And usually after they ask that, they follow that up with, well, what did it start out as? And what it is supposed to be sort of an homage to Grand Prix cars of the 1920s and 1930s. What it started out as was basically just a collection of tubes. There was no existing chassis, there was no existing body, there were no existing plans. This is something that I drew up the chassis, I drew up the suspension, drew the ideas for the body out. It was based on those late 20s, early 30s cars. But I didn't try to mimic anything or anything like that. It started out as a collection of tubes and straight tubes and flat sheet metal. And I've done, I think it's probably fair to say, 99% of the work putting it together. The engine, and it's embossed in the valve cover, is actually a Jeep engine. It's an overhead cam inline 6, 230 cubic inches. And the one that I've got was something that we pulled out of a 1964 Jeep Gladiator. The transmission that came attached to this engine and was in that Gladiator is not something that would have been installed in that Gladiator from the factory. The engine, however, is, but this engine, even though I pulled it out of a 1964, the casting numbers say that it's from 1965. So I believe that this is actually out of a Willys either overland wagon or Willys pickup truck from 1965. And that is actually where the idea for this grill ornament came from. It's kind of a handmade version of an old Willys car hood ornament. We've got a supercharger, still in the process of finishing up the plumbing for that. That's actually out of a 99 Pontiac Grand Prix. Be a Holley 4-barrel. The transmission I had to significantly modify. This was actually out of a four-wheel drive Jeep, and it's such a hassle getting a transmission that will fit these that rather than try to source a two-wheel drive transmission, I made components, modified things, cut things up, and turned that four-wheel drive 3-speed, it is a 3-speed, into a two-wheel drive transmission. So it is just rear-wheel drive only now. The rear axle that is in it is a Dana 44. It came out of a 1965 Jeep Wagoneer. People frequently ask about these long suspension arms coming from the axle, and I've had people say that they like them, people say that they don't like them, people say that they're stupid, people say that it was just done for the aesthetic. The thinking behind that is the weight distribution of the car is almost 50-50. I mean, it's literally 12 pounds off. And my thinking was to try to get the actual drive input from that axle to the center of gravity of the car. And my belief there is that it will basically make this car more drivable when you're transitioning from onto and off of the throttle. The other side of the hood up, you can actually see the valve cover better over here. The engine is actually offset 3 inches, and that is to try and balance out my weight as the driver, which is obviously offset from axle center line. And that's one of the things that helps it become as weight balanced as it actually is. The header is also handmade. The flanges are handmade. You basically can't buy much of anything for this engine in the United States. The pulley that's going to be used to drive the supercharger is actually a power steering pulley from a Fox Body Mustang. A friend made an adapter to be able to bolt that pulley to the crank pulley from the Jeep engine. Down looking at the front suspension, I've had people question whether or not this is just a Mustang 2 front end. It's not. This is something that I designed, did all the architecture and geometry with. So, made the upper and lower control arms, bought the coilovers to fit it. What you've got is a brake caliper from a 1996 Impala SS, and the wheel bearing and brake rotor are actually from a 2004 Jeep Grand Cherokee. The Impala, you couldn't get a caliper bracket that was the style that I wanted to use the unit bearing, and the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the upright, wasn't able to use the Impala caliper. But because the Impala is a sporty car, you can get a better grade of brake pad for it. The steering rack that's in it, this is rack and pinion steering. The steering rack is the type of thing that you would find on a Cobra kit car or some old MGs. The wheels are 15x6s. It's got bias ply vintage racing tires on it. And it works. I've driven the car. It handles very, very well because of the bias ply skinny tires. There's not an overly large amount of grip to it, but the car doesn't weigh much. It's less than 2,300 pounds with me sitting in it, even though the body is all steel. Same size tire and wheel in the back. It does still have drum brakes in the back. I've not designed discs for the back of this car. Next question I get, is it fast? Well, fast is kind of relative. The engine didn't have the correct carburetor on it when I got it. I've obviously not driven it yet with the supercharger installed, so it was driven around with a carburetor that was way too small for the inline six. And it was pleasurably quick. I mean, it was probably as quick as an early Miata. And while nobody calls those early Miatas fast, they're fun to drive. With the supercharger on it, I'm not expecting to set the world on fire. I'm thinking 225 horsepower, maybe 325 foot-pounds of torque. Again, the car is light for a car, especially in this day and age. But the 3-speed that's in it, the thing will be screaming at 115 miles an hour. There's just no way to effectively gear the car to go faster than that. But that's quick enough. Another question I get is about the tachometer. I've had people ask why it's crooked or say that it's crooked, but that was an old school trick. The red line on these engines is very low, especially for what people are used to nowadays. And you would set the tachometer up to where when the needle was pointed straight up, it was time to shift. So that's how this is. Just over 4,500 RPM, it's time to shift. The engine is tapped out. You don't want to take it any faster than that, you'll just break it. The last thing I'll speak on is the color and the body. Right now it's just in white primer. It's not painted, it's not body worked. It was in bare metal. I had to have it outside for a little bit and it started to rust on me. So I put white primer on it to try to keep the rust down. You could tell on the shots with the hood open or the interior. I don't have the whole thing painted. I do like the blue. I will keep the blue. But overall, this is the color scheme that it's pretty much going to be. Main part of the body white, suspension, the front end blue, red wheels, red seat fabric. The idea behind the color scheme back in the day that this was supposed to mimic, the official racing colors for the United States were white with blue stripes or white with blue trim. And I like the idea of sort of what would be an interpretation of an American Grand Prix car being red, white, and blue. I do want something a little less vivid white, which the car is very dirty sitting in the shop right now anyway. But I do like the red, white, and blue. Another question is, or another thing people say is that they've called it a death trap, and I don't necessarily agree with that. It is a small car. It is not a tiny car. It has a 5-point harness in it. The body skin is all 20 gauge steel other than the floorboard underneath the driver's feet. But there's a tubular steel structure. And there's a lot of places where that tubular steel frame is still visible. So essentially you're surrounded by a roll cage. You've got the big roll hoop over your head. So I don't think that this is any less safe than a car of this era would have been. It's vastly more safe than any of those cars. Risk is risk. I ride motorcycles too. They're going to be inherently less safe than something like this. But I enjoy the car. I've enjoyed the process of making it. I think it looks cool. I think there's some some angles of it that look fantastic. But it's mine, and I'm very happy with it. And I enjoy getting to show it off to people. It's brought smiles to people's faces when I've had it out, and it makes things nice.